All right, thank you everyone for coming today. So this is our second professional conversation, this time with John Hawkins, Dr. John Hawkins, who is a staff member here in the Faculty of Business, Government and Law. And John, as you probably know, is an economist by training. One thing I just kind of wanted to do before I give you a bit of an introduction about John and John's history is to remind you to please turn off your phones or at least put them onto silent so we can't hear them buzz or make noises. That would be very appreciated given that we're recording. What I'll do is now introduce John, and then we're going to have a conversation around John's kind of professional history and work experience. And then John has actually really kindly offered to do a little bit of a presentation on his insights into the coronavirus and the economic impacts of that. So I'm really looking forward to that because I think John's always, I would call him a thinking man's Alan Kohler for those of you that watch the ABC. So I'll just do my introduction first, and then we'll have the conversation as we did last week. So John Hawkins is actually an economist and political historian by training. John's research interest focuses on macroeconomics, especially central banking, and Australian political history. John teaches economics, international political economy, behavioural economics, global business and international relations. And John's PhD thesis in particular explored the evolving role of Australian treasurers as both managers and reformers of the economy. So I remember actually going to John's presentation on that just before he submitted too. So John actually holds a Bachelor of Economics from the University of Sydney, a Masters of Arts and a Masters of Applied Finance from Macquarie University, a Masters of Science in Economics from the London School of Economics, and lastly a PhD in International Relations from the ANU, politics and International Relations from the ANU. In addition to John's very impressive kind of intellectual training, John has also kind of experienced a wide range of vocational areas, including roles in both the public and banking sectors. Most recently, John has actually been Secretary of the Senate Economics Committee at Parliament House, a role that kind of oversees the key government financial policies of the day. Another highlight identified John that we'll talk a little bit about in this kind of chat is the role he played as Secretary for an inquiry into climate change. In correspondence with me, John actually noted that this was a major kind of policy failure that he was involved with, but he bears no responsibility for it. He puts that all on the politicians' shoulders. So we can maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of assessment 2, which is a policy analysis. John has also worked, though, importantly, formally, I guess, as an economist at the Bank for International Settlements, as well as the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Reserve Bank Australia, and finally in the Domestic Economy Division of the Australian Treasury. So John's had a whole range of different experiences around economics, and so I'd like you all to welcome John through applause, and thank you for coming. Thank you. So thank you for coming. So the first question that I kind of wanted to ask is, why did you actually decide to study economics in university?
Well, when I was at high school and I was thinking sort of what I wanted to do, I was looking for something that I thought was interesting, but also that I thought I could do okay. So at one stage, I had an interest in ancient history, but I thought there wasn't much scope for a career as an ancient historian. So I thought, probably the university lecturer that teaches 50 students, one of them replaces the lecturer, and the other 49 have to do something that's nothing to do with ancient history. And I thought, well, what are my chances of being that one in the 50? And I'd studied Latin and French in year 10, and I'd done well enough to get an okay mark in the exam, but I realised that it really wasn't my strength, languages. So my chance of being able to master a Syrian or something to become an ancient historian was pretty low. So I gave that idea up. My best subject at high school had been maths. My father wanted me to be an actuary, but I thought that might not be all that interesting. And I was interested in politics, so I thought that economics might sort of combine the maths and the sort of politics aspects, public policy interests. And so I did that in year 11 and 12, and I enjoyed it. So that made me think that it was something I wanted to pursue as a career and do at university. The other thing I had in mind was I needed to do something where I could get some sort of scholarship to support myself through university. And I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship from the Reserve Bank to do my undergrad degree at university. And so that's also why I started off in the Reserve Bank as a place to work. Also worked there during the summer holidays. So they also provided a summer job for me.
Wow, that's quite a fun summer job holiday. I think I made donuts on my holidays. But anyway, so what kind of things did you dislike about studying as an undergraduate student?
I don't know, there was a lot I disliked. It's easy to say about some things I did like. I mean, I liked escaping from the discipline of high school. I liked the sort of freedom. Although I observed that some of my fellow students seemed to sort of abuse that freedom. On the way from the railway station to the lecture rooms in the morning, I had to go through the student bars. And I used to, on my way in the morning, see a few students in those bars. And then on the way home in the afternoon, going back to the railway station, I'd see the same students look like they'd been there the whole day. So I could see that there are downsides to the freedom you have. But all of you have made it through the third year, so you're obviously more like me than like the students who spend all their time in the bar over this year.
That or they're just very good at keeping up appearances on both sides of that nature. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about your work history and kind of some of the highlights that you've got from what you've done?
Yep, so as I said, I had the scholarships from the Reserve Bank and I stayed there on and off for about 20 years. But during that time I had a couple of secondments and other breaks, which kept it a bit more interesting. I think I would have got bored if I'd spent 20 years just in Martin Place. So one of those secondments was to Hong Kong, to the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, so their version of the Reserve Bank. And that was probably one of my career highlights. I went there only a few months after the organisation had been established. And it was very refreshing to be in a new organisation because you weren't having people telling you, well, this is the way it's always been done. So you had a lot more scope to say, well, this is the way I think it should be done. And I was at a fairly senior position. I was head of the economics area there. So that was probably a career highlight. Also, I had initially a secondment to the Bank for National Settlements in Switzerland. And I ended up, I liked it there so much that I ended up leaving the Reserve Bank and getting a full-time job at the Bank for National Settlements.
Wow, okay. So international travel, that's awesome. Okay. So you've obviously got that career plan relatively kind of thought out in your head a little bit from university or from school to university and so on. But I just wondered if you, in retrospect, if you could suddenly kind of wave a magic wand and kind of decide what your profession and kind of occupation was going to be, would you have any kind of change of heart in terms of what you're doing, or would it be something completely different?
Depends how much power the magic wand had. I mean, in terms of what would I like to be doing, probably like to be in politics, but the magic wand would probably have had to do something with my sort of personality to make that feasible. I need to be tougher, thicker skinned, maybe more confident.
To become a politician.
Yeah.
Okay, right, yeah, okay. All right, so in terms of your career in the public sector and kind of some of the things that you've mentioned already, what kind of encounters have you had in relation to kind of changes of government or changes of treasurer or whatnot, and kind of the impacts that's kind of had on you in the bureaucracy? What kind of, has there been any kind of impacts, or is it kind of a little bit more steady as she goes kind of process?
The time I was in the Reserve Bank, you're fairly insulated from that. The Reserve Bank likes to say it's independent, but that's largely true. So it was quite a shock when I went to Treasury at how different that was. That you spend an awful lot of time in Treasury preparing material for the Treasurer, and I think that's a problem in that you start to be brainwashed by your own propaganda in a sense. So you're spending so much time saying we're in the best of all possible worlds because of the brilliance of our leadership, that it then becomes hard to sort of write things identifying problems that are in the economy because you've got into this mindset of always saying everything's good.
Right. So there's a tension between having a sense of independence versus what's kind of being articulated from above. In terms of on that point though, the difference between say the treasurer, but also the senior executive in Treasury, how does that kind of relationship play out in relation to then working through a new policy or working on a brief? Is there?
Yeah, I was there towards the end of Peter Costello's period as treasurer, and that was probably one of the less interesting times to be in Treasury, because by that stage Peter Costello had just sort of got tired. I remember him saying after his second or third budget, he said, I've probably got about 7 budgets in me. And by this stage, he was on his 12th or 13th budget.
Yeah.
And his focus had really become hoping to take over as the Prime Minister rather than making any economic changes. So the period of reform when they introduced the GST in 2000 was sort of well behind him.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Some of the people who've been in Treasury a long while used to get nostalgic about the Keating era of all these radical changes where all these ideas that Treasury wanted to implement for years, suddenly they had a treasurer who was enthusiastic about them, could sell them and would push them through cabinet.
Yep.
Whereas the time I was there was a very sort of quiet period. And it was also a period when the economy was just sort of chugging along reasonably well, so there was not a lot of action in the sort of macroeconomic area either.
Okay. Very interesting. And so in terms of that experience and other kind of public sector experience, what kind of strategies have you implemented in terms of when you've had a setback, whether it be a kind of policy setback and frustrations around not getting things kind of, I guess, through a process? What kinds of strategies do you kind of adopt in that kind of situation?
As you mentioned in the introduction, the climate change I see as being the great sort of policy failure in Australia over the last couple of decades, and I was sort of around that in a couple of different capacities. I was at Treasury just after the Stern report came out in the UK, and I remember trying to get people in Treasury sort of more excited about that topic and more interested in it. And I was giving seminars and so on to sort of promote the idea of introducing an emissions trading scheme and so on, which Treasury came to support. And it looked like under the Howard government we might have got a scheme. He commissioned the head of PM&C, Peter Shergold, to come up with a scheme. And then, of course, Kevin Rudd described it as a great moral challenge of our generation and came up with a scheme, but then backed away from it after there was political opposition. And then Julia Gillard introduced the scheme, but then got scrapped by the next government. After I left Treasury, I was working as the Secretary of the Senate Economics Committee, and we did a couple of reports on climate change. But then the Senate resolved to set up a select committee specifically on climate policy, and so a secretary was needed of that committee, and I sort of leapt on it like a ravenous dog after a bone or something. So I thought, this is what I really want to do, and this is a chance to get the relevant experts in, try to discredit the sort of spurious arguments that were being put, and try to build some sort of consensus to move forward.
Can I just pause you there for a second? Can you describe, just so everyone's aware, what a Senate Selects Committee actually is? Because I think that would be a useful context.
So a lot of the work that the Senate does is done through committees rather than the full deliberative body of the Senate. And some of the committees are standing, so they continue on through each parliament, like the economics one. Others are set up to investigate a specific topic, in this case investigating climate policy. And there'll be the chair and the deputy will come from opposite sides of politics by convention, opposite parties, and there'll also be representatives from minor parties, often independent senators on it as well. And they sort of proceed by calling for submissions from relevant experts and interest groups, and then they'll have public hearings, and not just in Canberra but all around the country, in which experts will come and they'll be questioned by the senators. Usually the Secretariat drafts the questions for the senators to ask in the background. And then a report is written or drafted by the Secretary and then issued in the name of the senators. If it's a committee chaired by the government, then there'll also be often a minority report put by the opposition members of it. If it's a non-controversial issue, they might be able to reach sort of a consensus. So there's sometimes on some sort of issues, there's sort of a reaching across the aisle and a downplaying of partisan differences. The climate issue, of course, was a controversial issue, so there it was a lot harder to reach agreement. It was harder even to agree on which witnesses to call for that inquiry.
So how did you deal with that then, given that there obviously is such contentious stakes in the debate around climate change, especially at that time? I mean, I guess depending upon the members who were in that committee would depend quite heavily.
Yeah, it was quite a pressured environment. So as the Secretary, I was responsible for organising the hearings and inviting people to appear. And of course, there was quite a diversity of opinion amongst the senators as to who should be called. So there was one school of thought that balance meant half the scientists you call had to be climate skeptics and half had to be people who believed in climate science. And the other view, which was my view, was that given at that stage about 98% of scientists believed that climate change existed, if you wanted a representative sample, you should have had only 1 out of 50 of the scientists that were called being climate skeptics. The other problem was that even though in Canberra in particular there's a huge number of climate scientists, and around the country there's even more, we couldn't find a single climate scientist who thought that global warming wasn't happening. So we ended up having to get retired geologists and engineers and so on, just to have somebody with some sort of scientific background who could put that view.
So the kind of adjacent scientific fields are the ones that you've been using in that case. Okay, that's really interesting. And so I guess in terms of trying to manage that process, though it obviously would have been somewhat stressful, but probably quite rewarding in some unusual way, maybe?
It was sort of exciting, but I was being bashed around the head by, if I invite someone on one school of thought, one side of politics would be criticising me, if I invite someone on the other side would be criticising me. It did make for some robust discussions on occasion.
Yeah, wow, okay. So, all right, so looking back over your career, what, I guess, would you identify as probably the most defining aspect of what you've done, and kind of how you think it kind of contributed to your outlook for your own kind of career development?
Well, that inquiry would be one of the things that's sort of most memorable, because I thought the stakes were very high. And certainly I learnt a lot from it. My knowledge built up in the course of the inquiry.
Yep.
And I felt we were able to draft quite a good report that sort of accurately reflected the majority scientific views and policy implications from that. So I was sort of satisfied with what we produced. Of course, the frustrating thing was it not translating into an enduring good sort of policy outcome.
So what types of work have you found the most fulfilling in terms of your day-to-day kind of existence?
Some of those Senate inquiries I think were quite interesting, partly because they were often relatively short, and you could see in some cases a tangible improvement in legislation. So the inquiry would identify some sort of unintended consequences that might come out of some legislation, which could then be amended to avoid those unintended consequences.
In terms of how your views and perceptions of the world kind of have changed, I'm kind of interested to see if coming into academia a little bit later on has that had any impact upon, compared to the time in the public sector, compared to academia? Have your perceptions kind of changed about the role of politics and the economy, or is it kind of all it all kind of gets factored into your thinking?
Well, I came into academia, as you say, quite late, so my views were probably heavily formed by that stage.
Yep.
I guess for me, the difference in being academic rather than a public servant or committee staffer is that you've got a lot more freedom to say what you think as an academic. I mean, as a public servant and a committee secretary, I had to try to be as impartial as I possibly could, and I couldn't go public with comments that would seem as favouring one side or another.
So developing a strong poker face was probably a strategy you needed to do?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And biting your tongue a lot.
Right, yeah.
Because it's interesting that in sort of informal conversations with you, the politicians seem to always assume that you would agree with their views.
Yeah.
And so you sort of no, that's interesting. Even if you thought this is complete rubbish, but of course you can't say that.
Of course not. So just to kind of change gears a little bit for now, so in terms of when you go through interview processes and kind of going through recruitment rounds, I just wondered what kinds of strategies you used in terms of developing your either application, but even your...
Do you mean as an applicant or the interviewer?
Well, firstly as an applicant, just because we've got lots of students here that are going through a lot of these processes and finding it quite difficult to continue on. So as an applicant first off, but if you've also had recruiting, I'd be interested to hear that too. So.
In a sense, by the time you're at the interview, a lot of what you need is sort of too late. I mean, the important thing is to have, good qualifications and good experience and so on. So you can't do that in the time between when the job advertisement appears and when you're at an interview. In terms of at the interview itself, I understand that don't be worried if you're feeling nervous. The interviewers will sort of expect that, and that won't be a problem. And don't be too risk averse. That can just make you come across as somebody who doesn't have any opinions on anything.
So let your personality
yeah, so I think
shine
let the personality shine through. I mean, one of the things an interviewer is often thinking is this somebody that I'd like working for me or like to be working with, and that I think will get on with the other team members. So if you seem a bit too dull and boring and buttoned up, that's probably can be a problem.
But the opposite's true too, right?
Yeah, going to the other extreme can be a problem. During my experience as an interviewer, I can recall occasions where I was on an interview panel and there were wild differences in the views of the different interviewers. So one example that springs to mind is where we were interviewing for economists, and another person on the panel was a generalist, not an economist. And we had totally different opinions about the people who appeared before us. So somebody who appeared and answered questions very uncategorically really appealed to my colleague, who said, this person was decisive and strong and spoke quickly and so on. Very impressive candidate. Whereas to me, I thought, well, yeah, they spoke very confidently, but they were wrong. And and that's often the most dangerous person, the person who's sure they know the answer and they're wrong. And also I thought their answers were quick, but they were also rather sort of glib and cliche. And then another candidate, my colleague thought, no, not very good, hesitant, lacked confidence. Whereas I thought, okay, she sort of paused a bit before she gave the answer, but then it was a considered, thoughtful, nuanced sort of answer, and seemed factually based. And I thought, sort of person I did want. So it was quite different. And so that's one aspect where there's an element of luck in the process. You might get an interviewer who's on your wavelength, or you might get the interviewer who's looking for something else. So inevitably there is a lot of luck in the interview process. So I think one of the important things is don't take it too badly if you don't succeed at the interview. And in the majority of cases, people who get to an interview and don't get the job, it's not because there's something wrong with them. It's just that there was another applicant who was maybe only slightly better.
Yeah, and so that's something to have some solace in, the fact that you've made it through that process, potentially have been employable, but there's somebody else that's gotten there just in front of you. That's actually a really fascinating observation though, in terms of the how a recruitment panel will kind of have different opinions on applicants, because I think that's one thing that we don't really realise as applicants, and I certainly think that's a valuable observation. Without a doubt. You see personality traits in the person you're looking at more so, and drawing those through. So you did talk a little bit about, just trying to calm your nerves and whatnot, but in terms of career planning, what kind of strategies have you put in place, if at all any, in developing kind of, I guess, how you've forged your career?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to plan a career because things are just so unpredictable. I certainly never thought, at age 21, I'm going to spend X number of years at the Reserve Bank, and then I'll go and work in Switzerland, and then I'll be in Hong Kong and so on. So I think it's a matter of being prepared to seize opportunities as they come to you. So, for example, taking a job in Hong Kong was a gamble on my part. At the time, I'd never been to Hong Kong. In fact, I'd never even been to Asia. So I had really no idea whether or not I'd like it. And I did realise that probably there were going to be people in the organisation who were going to be working for me who thought they should have got the job, not me. So I knew that would be a challenge to deal with. But I thought, well, I don't get these sort of opportunities often. It's a chance to make a big difference. It was at a higher level than what I was in Australia. So I thought I should seize that opportunity. So I think being prepared to take risks and take opportunities is important. But then you've also got to be in the best position to be given those sort of opportunities. So having lots of qualifications, having good experience, and having performed well, having a reputation of being a hard worker and a reliable person and so on, all very important to make sure that you get those opportunities and then sort of grab them. You may end up regretting some of them, but I think that's better than not seizing any of them and missing out on a lot of chances.
So that kind of almost answers my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case if you think there's anything else of relevance there. But like from a recruiter perspective, what kinds of tips and insights do you think you would provide for people that are about to graduate in terms of not having all that much professional experience, in terms of actually thinking about the application process, but also going through interview contexts?
I mean, if you're going for an entry-level job in Treasury or the Reserve Bank, then they're not going to expect you to have had experience. If they know that you're only 22 and just come out of university, then they're going to sort of accept that. But I guess what they're looking for is people who've shown an interest in the area, people who have a passion, or at least an interest in policy issues, and a bit of intellectual curiosity. Somebody who will probably pick up concepts reasonably quickly. Someone who'll sort of be a team player. I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, my last question before we get to hear you in your lecture format is just on a question around mentors. So I wondered if you had any insights into, do you actually go, methodically thinking about who your mentors are, or what role do you think they even play on your own development as a kind of work?
I've never had somebody with the sort of formal title of a mentor,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure whether sort of attempts at sort of blind dates, setting up people as mentors would work terribly well. But in an informal way, sure, I think it happens sort of all the time. You have colleagues that you work with that are more experienced than you, and that you get on well with, and you should take that opportunity and ask them for advice if they're more experienced than you. Gave you as a mentor in that sense, as an academic context, because I came here, as you said, fairly late in life, and I didn't have a lot of experience in a lot of aspects of academic work. So,
and University of Canberra is a somewhat bureaucratic organisation with various processes, so yes. All right, well, thanks, John. So look, we're going to stop there. So I'd like everyone to thank John for talking to us.